Hello, I'm Stephen Robinson. Welcome to the Play Typer Guy podcast. My guest today is artist and activist Tina Duryea, creator of the Sheroes series of portraits and products celebrating women. So let's get into this while my wife is still listening. Hi, Tina. How are you?
I am great, and how are you?
I'm doing well. So thank you so much for coming on to speak with us. I read something you had posted on social media after Democratic advisor James Carville had basically said the most ridiculously misogynistic statement imaginable um, regarding quote unquote preachy women. And I'd written about this and I thought it was sort of
Preachy.
preachy females. Yes, women is almost like it was very Tim Curry from Rocky Horror, the
Yeah.
females.
Ooh, scary.
Yes, I sort of reflexively humanized you. Uh, but yes, preachy females, and it's to me spoke to sort of this general what I've been observing tension, growing tension within the Democratic Party. And I think you touched on it so well in something you posted on social media. If I could read that real quickly. Um, Unfortunately, James Carville is not alone. There are too many Democratic men and some women who want women to stay in their place, which to them means in the background, doing all the unpaid volunteer work, making sandwiches and coffee. They don't want to give women a seat at the table. He is not alone. And can you follow up more on that, if you mind?
Of course, and I thank you so much for having me on, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this further in depth. Uh, First, I want to just start everything off by saying, like, I'm voting Democrat. I will always vote Democrat as long as things remain the way that they are, and I support the Democratic Party. That being said, there are some tensions, as you mentioned, within the Democratic Party, such as what James Carville talked about when he said preachy females. And um, I think what I see happening with people like James Carville, and there are many of them in the Democratic Party, is like Democrats are the party that's going to vote the right way on women, and they'll give women a few token seats at the table. But a lot of men, white men, straight white men, do not want to give up enough seats at the table to make the Democratic Party actually 100% look like what we are. We are a big tent party. We are LGBTQ. We are Black, Indigenous, people of color. We are women. And for the history of the party, for the history of the human race, it has been controlled by straight white men. And they're willing to give Democratic men are willing to give a small portion of seats to those people who do not look like them. But they get very uncomfortable when we get past a certain number of people who look like them. And there's a fantastic, and I wanted to pull up the actual study, but I forgot before we got on this study that shows that if you have a room full of men and women, and the women talk something like 30% of the time, and then you survey the group of people, they will say that women are dominating the conversation. And I think that what we see with James Carville is the same thing. He thinks that us preachy females are dominating the Democratic Party, whereas we're just actually finally getting a small say in the party.
hmm and you were talking about representation, and I think representation can be perhaps misleading. So superficial representation. And I've been in a situation as a person of color working at publications and so forth, and when they sort of, oh, we need to have Black writers or and so forth, and you get there, and then it's like, oh, you have a different opinion. What I wanted was to continue to express the same opinion, to prioritize the same sort of things, but have it look better because there's, you and I are working there, but
Yeah.
it's still the same agenda, the same perspectives as when it was all white men, but Tina and Stephen are working there to sort of give it an illusion of diversity. But when we have different perspectives, that's when the Carvilles of the world sort of freak out and object to how things are going. That's been my observation. It's sort of the benefit that the Republican Party has because there's superficial diversity. So if you have say a Tim Scott or a Nikki Haley, or God forbid Marjorie Taylor Greene becomes the vice presidential nominee, they are they not they have the superficial diversity, but they are promoting the same agenda, and that's not what's happening in the Democratic Party. There's clearly our priorities are very different than, let's say, a 79-year-old white guy like James Carville. The preachiness was also interesting. Something I touched upon was that he distinctly gendered it, right?
Mhm.
So I think we can both agree that ourselves, voters, we don't like fundamentalism. So if your concern is that voters don't like being perhaps preached to or lectured, or and there's a way that we can communicate in ways that is inclusive and inspiring, yes we can style stuff, although Carville wasn't an Obama supporter in 2008.
Oops,
um
I don't remember that.
but it but he was distinctly it's all very sort of, women have introduced these things, that the nanny state, the cancel culture, all these things, it's all linked back to women, sort of the Nurse Ratched thing. Have you been observing that as well? Like sort of the spoiling the party type vibe?
So the entirety of wokeness is the fault of women, which thank you. Thank you. Like, wow, women actually did something good. And I actually think that is, perhaps he's right. I mean, feminism for at least the past, I'm not a historian, so I don't know when intersectional feminism actually started to be a thing, but for the entirety of my, recent political kind of feminist career, intersectionality has been an important part of being a feminist. And you cannot be a feminist and be anti-LGBTQ. You cannot be a feminist and not be concerned of, you know, Black Lives Matter and, the whole big, huge uh, umbrella of wokeness is supposed to fall under the umbrella of feminism, which I might just want to point out is a really big ask for one movement, which we don't ask other movements to take care of. But like, feminist movement is supposed to be intersectional. And in James Carville world, that would probably mean woke. And so, yeah, maybe because women have gained a small but significant voice within the Democratic Party perhaps has become more woke and concerned about these issues, because the whole entire conversation around feminism says we must make sure that if we are going to fight for the rights of women, we also fight for the rights of everybody. And, maybe he's right. Maybe feminists have made the entire Democratic Party more woke. And as I said before, I thank you.
But that isn't that sort of frustrating, as you had talked about, women doing the hard work in the background, the unpaid labor, the canvassing, the going door to door, the phone banking, and specifically post Trump, it's been women and people of color who have been the most marginalized and have a right to be preachy, certainly angry. Like you're losing bodily autonomy, you're losing, affirmative action. Felt like, from Roe to the affirmative action decision, there's certain things that are specifically targeting vulnerable groups who simultaneously Democrats rely on to come out in epic numbers to volunteer. And I think, as you alluded to earlier, the implication is often like, well, where else are you going to go? Which seems like a very abusive relationship. It's like, well, if they're even worse,
Yeah.
whereas we will, at least not hurt you even more. And what we really need to focus on are white male voters that we've lost, and we need to desperately get those folks back. And everything seems to be an appeal to those voters more so than, as the expression in politics go, the people who you danced with, who brought you to the dance.
Yeah, I will say that, when it comes down to voting, I always say it's not a marriage. And like, this is a common phrase. I'm not marrying the person I'm voting for. I'm voting for the
Mhm.
person who is going to harm me the least and benefit me the most and will actually get elected. Because let's be real, there's people who might be more aligned with me that I'm not going to vote for because they're not going to get elected. So that being said, I think what I have seen as a woman, and the first time I always use this example because it took place way before I kind of, I mean, I've always been politically engaged and active. That's just, I mean, I was 18 and I was engaged and active. And I think I did my first protest. I organized my first protest when I was 16. So it's not that I wasn't engaged and active, it's just the level has changed and stuff. It was maybe 2 years after Sandy Hook, and my friend had helped organize Mom Demand Action. I'm in Connecticut. Connecticut's the home of Sandy Hook. And she was a leader for Moms Demand Action. And she said, there's this thing happening in the Capitol in Hartford, and we need people to show up to support this thing. And can you come? And I had a flexible schedule. And so I said, my friend, she's asking me, gun control, huge issue for me. Also, a very gendered issue, which no one ever talks about how gendered gun control is. But the vast majority of people who are fighting for gun control are women, and the vast majority of people who are against it tend to be men. So I went up to Hartford. I took a day off from work, and I get there, and we're all milling around talking. And then they start the event, and they have this wall of women behind the podium, and the people who speak, many who are elected officials to this day, all spoke, and they were all men, all white men. I don't think there was a single, you know, let's be really clear. And so I remember that was kind of my aha moment when I was like looking around. I'm like, okay, all of your backdrop, all of the people who are doing the work are women. And the person getting all the credit standing in front of the microphone saying, look at how great I am. I'm fighting for gun control is a white man who is a advocate for gun control, and I do appreciate the work they do. But that was sort of the light bulb moment for me. And it's only become more and more clear in the ensuing years, and it's been about a decade since that happened, that I just see it happening over and over again. I
Mhm.
go I go to volunteer, and 90% of the room is women, and 10% of the room is men. And when we and then we elect men, and there's a primary, and it was, we have a choice between a man and a woman, and it's always the man who gets picked. And I mean, I'm just speaking within my own state, obviously, because that's what I have experience with. I will say this, my state is fairly decent in terms of representation outside of gender, but they will regularly say, look how representative we are. Look at our platform. We have all these people running who are so diverse. And then you do the simple count. I'm going to count how many people in this diverse group. And you look at them and they're diverse and you say, oh, but only 20, 30% are women. But I'm sorry, last I checked, we were 51% of the population. So why is it that we say we do not see gender in diversity conversations within my state? And I can only speak about my state in this regards.
And that's such a great point. I think what you had described, I've written about as I've called it West Wing syndrome. And given my age, I was a fan of the show. I watched it, but you
I
look
need
at
to watch it.
reruns.
I've never seen it.
But if you look at the reruns, it's often a lot of brilliant, touchy white men uh, lecturing, preaching even to women who look at them adoringly and support them
Yeah.
and passing on their good liberal. I mean, exactly what you described. And I think that's been sort of what I've seen as sort of rightly the pushback. I think what's interesting. Um, Obviously you are nothing like the March of the Greens or the MAGAs in the world, but within the Republican Party, there was a sense of pre-Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene was there. There were the expectation that those people, Lauren Boebert and others, were there. They were also doing the work. They were also the voters. But the sense is, of course, the face of the party should be respectable. Should be a Mitt Romney or a John McCain. And you know, obviously that's going to be subjective how we define respectable, but eventually they're like, no, 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 we don't want that anymore, we want to run the show.
Mhm.
And there seems to be, I found, sort of almost sort of a commonality between anti-Trump Republicans and anti-Trump Democrats like Carville, the white men, who are sort of seeing it as um well, Republicans definitely failed in keeping the quote unquote crazies from taking over. And Carville's theme so far has been we need to make sure that our crazies are it's good enough for them to vote, good enough for whatever, but they can't run the show. Because then if they do, they'll scare away the white men. Essentially, it's all a country club. And he
And by
said
the way,
this a minute ago.
Carville's idea of the crazies on the Democratic Party are women.
Almost consistency. He doesn't recognize that, and he talks about the good old days where we used to always get along. It's like, well, you were just two white guys who, even if you very passionately were pro-choice as a man and passionately anti-choice as a man, okay, you can still go get a beer afterward. But like, yes, these are if this is not personally impacting you in certain ways. So yes, maybe you don't want to be buddy buddy with certain terrible people on the other side and so forth. And so it is that's what he's having trouble with. You had talked about, you know, electability, and that leads me to I also observed a discussion online you'd had with the anti-Trump writer at the Atlantic, Tom Nichols, and he had basically stated as a matter of fact that Kamala Harris, the vice president, isn't very popular. No one likes her. Um, and he's welcome to his opinion. We can discuss the vice president's political challenges if as they are. But what's interesting is that he then started complaining about the quote unquote K Hive cult after he basically says, no one likes this person. She's not popular. And then, well, then people came into his timeline to say, well, I disagree with you. And he just dismissed all of you as part of a cult, as opposed to being, oh, maybe she does have you know, powerful supporters or so forth. I don't know if you recall that
Well, I
exchange.
remember that very clearly. And I just kind of looked over my shoulder because I don't know if you can see it, but there's my Kamala cutout. And she sits here in my office, and I'm OG K Hive. I decided that I was going to support Kamala Harris in her presidential run in January of 2019. I thought she was brilliant. I thought she was everything I wanted in a candidate if it was not Hillary Clinton, because I was a supporter of Hillary Clinton too. And there's a lot of overlap between K Hive and Hillary Clinton supporters. And there's, I think the reason that it's so discounted is because that overlap tends to be heavily women and heavily people of color. Hillary Clinton had the support of the, you know, Black vote. I mean, that was how she won the nomination. That's how she defeated Bernie Sanders. And so the entire argument that, people who are anti Hillary Clinton was like, oh, well, she's, not popular. And it was the same conversation, right? Hillary Clinton's not popular. How did she win the primary if she was so unpopular? Oh, the people who voted for her were women and people of color. So we don't actually count their votes, right? Or we dismiss their votes because really all we care about is the white male vote. So if white men are not voting for Hillary or Kamala or Joe Biden for that matter, then it doesn't matter. We don't see color, we don't see gender. We only see when white men vote. And so I feel like that's a lot of what goes on with polling. And, it's been an interesting having been someone who was a passionate supporter and a very visible and vocal supporter of Hillary Clinton, who took a lot of fire in 2015 and 2016 because I was a supporter of Hillary Clinton. I took the same exact, almost verbatim, the same hits I took from supporting Hillary were the same hits I took for supporting Vice President Harris. And so that's why I just see the commonality between the two women.
Mm.
And, of course, the Vice President Harris has the added layer of or hurdle of the fact that she's also a Black woman. But at the end of the day, 90% of the comments I see about Vice President Harris, I saw about Hillary Clinton. And
Mhm.
that includes about her support. And that's why I think it is so, so critical to be vocal and visible in supporting Vice President Harris. Because what happened with Hillary Clinton was that the people who supported her were bullied and terrified into being quiet about their support. I don't know if you were aware of Pantsuit Nation?
Yes, there was.
You remember? Okay, because like, it was only like, it was a blip on the radar, but like 3 million women were members of Pantsuit Nation, and I was a member. And it was basically where every woman who was excited about Hillary Clinton went to be excited about her because they couldn't be excited about her in public because they would get bullied so relentlessly. And that creates a narrative of Hillary's not popular because you don't see public support for her.
Hmm.
Same thing happens with Kamala Harris, and that is why K Hive decided to they said that they weren't gonna let happen to the vice president what happened to Hillary. And they decided they were gonna be very vocal and very visible in their support of Vice President.
Hmm.
And, I think, have they been successful in their work? I don't know. I mean, I said I was an original K Hive. I would not say that, and I have a lot of friends in the K Hive, but like, I don't know. It's not an organized, it's organic, it's grassroots. There's no cohesive thing. So hard to quantify how successful they've been.
Sure.
But I do think, you have this thing where when someone like Kamala Harris steps up to the plate, when someone like Hillary Clinton steps up to the plate, these transformational leaders, it behooves us, if we want to see transformational change, to support them.
Hmm. I guess, yeah. And as a political writer, I guess perhaps the blunt way I tend to kind of look at it, if you kind of even going back to Obama to Bill Clinton, the popularity is defined by support amongst white men. Same
Mm,
with, like,
agreed.
so Obama did tremendously well amongst black voters, and black voters swinging to him during the primaries is why he obviously won, and it was a very close primary, but the narrative, he had a lot of the support of college students, particularly white male college students, and white journal, like the folks crafting the narrative.
Mhm.
And that benefited Bernie Sanders to a degree because they were the ones crafting the narrative that, um, and so that becomes, this is more of a question for you because I don't know how to solve it either. How do you resolve that? Because being public, in a way, we're invisible, but the Tom Nichols is someone crafting the narrative. So if he's like, and he states his facts in many of his articles, like Kamala Harris has political challenges, she's not a good politician. Those are always stated as facts. That's the narrative. The people at the New York Times who write these are predominantly white men, white people running, and they craft the narrative, and we're sort of already seeing, um and there's some debate as to whether uh there seems to be amongst those people, they kind of like Gretchen Whitmer more. We don't know whether that would even
They don't love
remain or
no.
stay. But to me, I obviously am aware that electoral college exists. I get that um we need a candidate who has to win essentially 3 states. It's weird, right? So they have to win Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And I get someone having the concern of like, okay, well, I get why Biden, outperformed among white voters in those states compared to Hillary Clinton. How does Kamala Harris outperform Hillary Clinton? And I think you sort of touched upon that about being more vocal and basically helping craft a new narrative. But you know, as someone who obviously doesn't want Trump to win or doesn't want DeSantis to win in like 2028 or whoever is running, to me, the legitimate question of can this candidate outperform Hillary in 2016 is legitimate. Um, but the problem is sort of right the who's crafting this narrative of who can do that, and how do we win those voters over? Like, so what are your thoughts on that? Sorry.
Well, the first question is, are we talking 2024 or 2028?
Mhm.
Because I cannot predict what the world's gonna look like in 5 years. And none of us can, and the whole entire world can change. We saw that in 2020 with the pandemic. I mean, I'm not going to talk about 2028 because I don't know what's gonna happen. As for 2024, and by the way, I love Gretchen Whitmer, but whenever people say I'd vote for a woman, just not Kamala, I'd vote for Gretchen Whitmer. It gives me a lot of flashbacks to 2016 when people said, I'd vote for a woman, just not Hillary. I'd vote for Elizabeth Warren. And then in 2020, the same people who said that they were going to vote for Elizabeth Warren didn't support her when she ran.
Mhm.
And so when people throw out Gretchen Whitmer or Michelle Obama as these like unicorn women candidates that they're going to support, I tend to just roll my eyes at them because I've seen it happen too many times
Mhm.
when someone said, I'd vote for a woman, just not that one. So love Gretchen. She's great. Met her. She's lovely. Would happily vote for her for president if she was the nominee. But when people say she's a better woman candidate than the vice president, I roll my eyes. And part of that's because, well, let's just take a step back. When I look at a candidate, who I am as a person, I want the best person for the job. And there is not a single person on this planet who is better prepared to be president after Joe Biden than Kamala Harris. I don't care if you don't like her politics or what. She has the experience. If you were hiring someone at a company, if I was a CEO of a company and I wanted somebody to take over from me, I would look at my second in command and say, this person already knows all of what they need to know. So
Mhm.
for me, that's just the way my mind works when I look at this.
Mhm.
I also understand and appreciate the fact that voters don't think that way.
No, it's a popularity contest, and unfortunately, women and uh, men of color who are those second in commands don't get the jobs in the private sector. They often go and get the someone from outside. So that's an unfortunate reality as
There there's
well.
there's a
That's
there's a very famous saying that in, I think there are more Fortune 500 CEOs with the name John than there are women
yeah,
CEOs.
yeah.
Yeah. And so, yes, I agree. That being said, we're not thinking about 2028. We're looking at 2024. And as you very rightly said, um, the editors in charge of most major publications are white men. And they come at everything with that bias, which is not 100% their fault. I mean, like, we can't overcome our biases as easily as we would like. I mean, we all, I think anybody who considers themselves a Democrat and a progressive mindset, we work our entire lives to try to overcome our biases, but there's going to be some latent stuff in there that we just have to just keep working and working at. So I don't 100% blame them for their bias, but I also 100% blame them for their biases and how it affects the entire world. A very interesting point, and I don't know, I haven't done any sort of analysis of Vanity Fair articles, but in general, I find Vanity Fair articles to be far more favorable of the vice president than other journalistic entities. Editor of Vanity Fair is a woman of color.
Mhm.
And she's like, literally, I think that Vanity Fair is one of the only major publications that has an editor in chief who is a woman of color. Um, I actually went to middle school with her. So like that's why I know, because like I don't really pay attention to that stuff. But you're absolutely right. Like, who shapes our narratives? The entire narrative of the world is shaped by men. And it's not just media and journalism, it's also our films. Let's think for a second of how many films or TV shows we've seen where there's been a Black woman president who is an inspiring president, not an evil president, because there are plenty of examples of women presidents who are bad guys. Like, what was that movie about a year ago? Meryl Streep played the president. It
Uh,
was,
yeah, I'm aware of the film, but it
yeah,
was
I
I
don't,
think
I
Jay
just, it escaped.
Serrata had done it. But yes, it was. And one example I give because I do know the name is Veep. I love Veep. It's funny. Julia Travis is brilliant, but there isn't, to your point, and I've written about this as well. There's no West Wing for women
Mhm.
where because that's a show where of course the Martin Sheen played a president everyone admires and looks up to, and he's brilliant. And there's no version of that. Like Veep is much more cynical, and so there isn't a kind of image of a inspiring kind of woman leader, which again, as you saying, starts to set that narrative into
Our
people's
collect
minds.
our collective psyche has no prototype for a woman in power. of sizable stature. Like, so that we have like Jacinda Ardern, who is the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Fantastic woman. We loved her. But New Zealand's New Zealand, it's not a superpower. We had Margaret Thatcher, but she was obviously very problematic. And it was a long time ago. So in the grand scheme of women leaders in the world, okay, we got Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, maybe. Like, I mean, but I don't know if I'm actually even like speaking.
Mhm.
Like, I don't know that the average person even has
No.
people in their collective psyche. So we don't. When I remember, and me, feminist, want a woman president. When Hillary Clinton ran in 2008 against Obama, I remember there being a part of my brain saying like, she doesn't seem presidential. Me, feminist, so indoctrinated with the idea that being presidential means being a man, that when I would see Hillary Clinton speaking back in 2008, I'd be like, oh, I want a woman president, but oh, she doesn't seem presidential, because no woman seems presidential because we've never seen a woman president.
Mhm. And I think even slightly related, I think a lot of the parodies and women have done this. SNL parodies of women leaders tend to present them as more diabolical,
Mhm.
or that's the
Evil.
joke, as opposed to often even when they're sending up someone like Trump, who literally is evil, it's in a goofy way, sort of like
Mhm.
a
Very.
goofy sitcom character that you kind of and I think Will Ferrell has even said he regrets making Bush seem kind of goofy likable when he was playing him, as opposed to actually he's kind of destructive. I should not have kind of made him kind of goofy. And I think that kind of speaks to sort of that but as you were saying, you're also a very practical person. So you're both um here's what the world should be, but also here's what the world is as a reliable voter. So that must be a tension, right?
Oh yeah.
Because the tension, I interviewed a Democratic strategist on here recently who shares a culture with Nikki Haley and had kind of resent how she's sort of used race, because she
Mhm.
was always sort of like, oh my God, Biden's dead. He's going to die. He might be dead already. And the worst thing that could happen is Kamala Harris, which clearly it's not even like Kamala Harris is like so it's so politically different. So it's like, oh, it'll be such a leftward shift. She's clearly targeting of like, clearly it's about, you know, certain voters who might have supported Biden who have a discomfort with her, and she's sort of weaponizing that, which is kind of shameful. Um, but in ways that going back to Whitmer, she probably would not have with Whitmer because of race. Race is sort of that, and I think it is fair to state that yes, Whitmer, again, if you're worried about the world ending and you're looking at a sheet of paper of like, okay, which of these candidates is going to who's going to carry Michigan? You have to carry Michigan. Is it someone from California or someone from Michigan? Because obviously, as you said, it should be about qualifications, but we don't have that. It's about did you grow up going to the same bar that I used to? A lot of crazy stuff. So I guess what I'm asking is, as someone who's very a practical voter and so reliable and has looked at that, how do you? Because the only way to sort of to change the narrative would be to say, like a lot of these white guys who voted for Biden, but are considered gettable. Like they like, okay, well, if it's Harris, then they're bolting. So we need to make sure it's another white guy or Gretchen Whitmer or someone. Do you say stop taking my vote for granted? Because the argument has been, and this maybe is a Malcolm X quote, but if you don't, you're going to be taken for granted. You're going to be treated like a chump, as his words. I'm sorry to put it in. I don't think you're a chump, but I'm just saying that was Malcolm X thing. Like people start to take you for granted and take us for granted.
What I always say when people talk about that, because I actually had a big fight today with people who were saying that they were going to vote uncommitted in the primary because they were upset with Biden's handling of the situation in Gaza. And I'm like, that only gives, in a pragmatic, forget about where you stand on the issue of the Middle East and Gaza. From a pragmatic standpoint, voting uncommitted gives fuel to the narrative that Biden is not popular within the Democratic Party and should not be the candidate, right? And coming back to this, always comes back to pragmatism. Biden is the nominee. He will, unless, God forbid, knock on wood, touch iron, whatever you want to do, unless something catastrophic happens, he is the nominee. We are going to nominate him in August in Chicago. I am applying to be a delegate. I hope to be a delegate in Chicago. So, assuming that Biden's a nominee, then if he were to hypothetically decide to swap out Vice President Harris with Governor Whitmer between now and August, that would signal, one, that he was really easily swayed by,
Mhm.
which is not something that you really want a president to be swayed by. And two, it would be him admitting that he had made a mistake in
Yeah.
picking her in the first place. And the most important decision a nominee makes when they're nominated for president before they're elected is who their running mate will be. So it would be him saying, I made my most important decision in 2020 was wrong. And that, just from a strategic point of view, from a narrative point of view, is catastrophic. I don't care
Mhm.
how popular Whitmer is. I don't care if the person if he replaced her with Governor Newsom, who everybody seems to think is the holy grail of Democratic candidates, which, by the way, is not true.
No.
Um,
He's still from California, so it's still the same challenges that I see
he's still
for
from California, and he has a lot of baggage that people haven't. He has never been vetted. It doesn't even matter. But like the thing is, if you were to replace Kamala Harris this year with anyone, even if you replaced her with Barack Obama,
Mhm.
you would be saying, I made a mistake of huge consequences.
Yes. So, but the tough question are gonna be, but again, if you're the reliable voter,
Mhm.
so even though you're a Harris supporter, you're still, at the end of the day, I pragmatically am gonna vote for the Democrat, and then he's thinking, well, I there's these Nikki Haley supporters and voters, and there's these the anti-Trump folks whispering in my ear, like Tom Nichols, who says we definitely, we white guys are, and we're definitely going to be on your side if you ditch her. And don't worry, because her biggest fans are the loyalists. They're still going to show up, right? So that goes back to, again, the Malcolm X thing about you are, it has to almost be, why is it catastrophic to dump Harris? It's catastrophic because you're not gonna you know, be there to make sure they win. And
I
I'm sorry for pressing that. It's just sort of, it's in my own mind.
The thing is, like, I am not the average voter.
Mhm.
I am an outlier. Anybody who cares about politics as much as me is a freak of nature and should not should not be considered your litmus test, right? Because and you know, I look at, we all know that the most loyal demographic for the Democratic Party is Black women. We all
Mhm.
know that. And if Biden were to remove the first Black woman, the first woman vice president in history, and replace her with anyone, I don't know that. It's tough. I'm not going to ever speak for Black women, right?
Mhm.
That's not my lane, and I'm not going to go into it. But I can't think that there's not going to be some blowback there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be, yes, we are your loyalist voters, but not to the point. There's a line you really can't draw in interest of catering to, because I have something I've noticed since 2016, um, and is that, yes, there's been a significant defection of former Republicans who are, and that's great that you are no longer, you know, that you're anti-Trump and you voted for Biden. Um, Even some of them, I think David Frum voted for Hillary Clinton. Obviously, not, he wasn't happy with that, but yes, I appreciate people who understood what was at stake. But because that's the coalition, and again, a lot of the white men who are defining the narrative, people like Josh Barrow and others, they always state, well, these are the people you need to keep happy because the other voters are, they're still going to turn out. I disagree with that. It's just sort of, what are ways that we can prove them wrong without obviously blowing our own foot off by not showing up, but we have to essentially state, well, you can't just take us for granted while courting. It's a tough.
It's a tough it's definitely tough, and it's something that what I always come back to, and there's a couple things going on here, and one is the idea that the white man never Trumper is your swing voter. I think that the actual swing voter is your white never Trumper suburban mom.
Mhm,
That's a different story. I will say again, and this is what I say, when I hold my party accountable, and I do my best to hold my party accountable, I do it by doing the work. And that is what I have learned from my friends who are Black women in particular. They have, taught me that when it comes to the general election, we don't have a choice. We don't. I'm sorry, I don't have a choice. If I care about myself, if I care about women, if I care about my friends who are people of color, if I care about my friends who are LGBTQ, there is no world where my choice is anything other than Democrat in a general election. Now, their thing is there's a whole world of other voting that happens, and that's the primary. And I have worked passionately in primaries to elevate candidates who are more in line with what I do. That is why in January of 2019, I said, Kamala Harris is my woman. She's a woman. She's a woman of color. She's brilliant. She is a fantastic record. Like her record is it's outstanding. I watched her grill Kavanaugh in the judiciary hearing. I was just blown away again and again and again and again by this woman who is just outstanding. And so I said, this is the woman I want to be in the White House. And I said, I will do everything in my power. I will take my entire social media platform that I have built supporting women candidates, and I will leverage it in favor of her. And so I did that for the entirety of 2019. And she withdrew from the presidential primary, and I think it was December of 2019. And I cried, right? Like I just cried. And I was so distraught. And then I said to myself, it's going to be Biden. At that point, this was like late 2019, before the pandemic hit, but it was the writing was on the wall. It was going to be Biden. So I said, Biden needs a vice president. And I wanted to be Kamala Harris. And so I said, okay, you know what? You know what will get his attention? So I was on her finance team. One of the ways that I helped her in 2019 was I was on her finance team. I'm not somebody with a lot of money. I have a couple of friends who have a lot of money, and I live in an area where there's a lot of money. But what I had was a large social media platform. And so I did a lot of micro donations, and I raised for the vice president $40,000. And then when she endorsed Biden right before the pandemic hit, after Warren dropped out, as part of her finance team, I moved on to the Kamala Harris, Joe Biden finance team. And I worked my ass off and I raised $100,000 for Joe Biden. And I am not saying that I am the reason that he picked her, but the fact of the matter is that she was raising more money for him than any of the other contenders for the VP slot. And that made a difference in the way that he thought about who he was going to pick as his VP. And
mhm,
I'm not saying that that's the only reason he picked her. I'm saying that that's one of the reasons. And so when you say, I don't, I know the Democrats take me for granted. I know that they exploit me and they rely on my unpaid labor nonstop. And I know that my vote in the general election is a captive vote. There is no way I'm not voting Democrat. But I will work my ass off every single day of the year in every other way to make the party more in line with who I am and what I want. I would love to have a women's party. I'd love to just say, can I say bad words on this program? I would just like to
yeah,
say, I would just like to say, I would just like to be done with the Democratic Party and be like in a women's party and just like lift up and celebrate women all day long, right? But I live in the real world. And
mhm,
so I will do everything in my power to lift up candidates in primaries here in my state and around the country so that we have more women and more diverse women getting elected to office in the primary. And that's just my
mhm,
kind of answer to that question of, yeah, I am a captive vote.
yeah.
There's no question.
Well, that's great. Well, and to the more of your uh your allies and folks to me as well. I try to do my. I'm kind of. I think part of the solution as well is to elevate these voices as much as possible because that's
Mhm.
not uh, always been happening. So again, based on slowly a sort of white male dominated media, there's clearly a narrative about Harris
Yeah.
uh, that you know you're doing a great job of counteracting as you can, and then otherwise, folks in the media need to also do some other part of it's not so much picking a side, but just actually reflecting what's real, that there is that support from folks like you and others who do support the vice president.
I want to actually say something about the media for a second because you've mentioned it several times. The world is changing so fast, right? We know that, and we know that legacy media like the New York Times and the Washington Post that are dominated by white male editors, they're still incredibly important, but their relevance is slipping. You see TikTok in particular, right? You see social media, you see podcasts, you see all of these social media conversations about politics that are informing voters. And
Mhm,
what it does is it creates a challenge. It also creates an opportunity. It creates an opportunity for people like myself to get out there on TikTok or social media and say, this is why I love the vice president. And it gives us an opportunity to change the narrative
mhm,
and gives power back to people. Now, it is so fraught with problems. I'm not dismissing that at all, but at the same time, it's also fraught with potential and
mhm.
good potential. So, you know, I have a lot of friends who are very anti TikTok, and I'm on TikTok because I'm like, you know what? This is where people are, and they need people like me. They need to hear from people like me who, support the vice president and do so passionately. And if I can sway a handful of people, there you go.
That's great. For folks watching this, they've already been witness to some beautiful artwork behind you that is your own.
Yes,
Um, could you tell us a little bit about it? And there are people listening who can't see, but if so, this is on YouTube. Check it out; it's worth it because it's lovely stuff. But can you tell us a bit about your art?
absolutely. And thank you. So I've been an artist for decades now. And, before 2016 and Hillary Clinton, I did a lot of nice landscapes and dog portraits and just, nice art. And then after the 2016 election in 2017, I pretty much lost my shit because I was like, what the hell is going on in the world? And I kind of got to this place where I'm like, why am I painting pictures that are, and I'd used my art for politics a little bit in the past, but never focused. And I kind of got to the point where I'm like, I don't want to be creating work that's kind of just putting a pretty face on the world when the world is Donald Trump as president. So in January of 2018, I said, I'm going to do this project for 1 month where I'm going to do a portrait a day of someone who inspires me because I needed to kind of motivate myself to get inspired about life in general. And by the end of the month, I realized that except for one example, I think I did Obama, but everybody else was a woman. And I was posting this stuff on social media, painting a portrait a day on social media. And it started to take off. And people were like sharing it all over the place. And women were saying that, they would have these conversations with their kids at dinner time saying, oh, she painted Maxine Waters today. And you know why she painted Maxine Waters is because Maxine Waters was reclaiming her time. And so there were these great narratives and discussions that came up because of the project. And then ironically, I kind of just took a picture of the portraits together and it became a grid, which you can kind of see. Which then somebody's like, oh, I want a phone case like that. And so I made all these products and I thought no one would buy them, but then everybody started buying them and it was great as an artist, very rewarding. But the project kept going because at the end of the month, I realized that we had to keep having these conversations about why these women mattered and why women matter in general. And so the year of 2018, 2019, 2018 was a huge year for women. We elected a record number of women to Congress. I did I don't know how many portraits I ended up painting that year, but it was a lot. And then after that, I kind of didn't paint quite as many portraits, but I kept doing this Shiro's project of these one-day portraits of women whenever a woman kind of came into, the news media. Like I just did Caitlin Clark, the basketball player. I'm a few days behind. I'm working on Beyonce portrait because of Cowboy Carter, because that's amazing. And so whenever women are in the news media, I tend to paint a portrait just to kind of help amplify them. And one of the reasons I'm using art as this medium and this vehicle is because historically, um, women in art were portrayed as objects of desire, and men were portrayed in art as leaders and people to look up to. And so by using the medium of oil portraiture to paint these women in ways that were kind of leadership roles, I hope to kind of give them some extra stature, right? And so that was sort of the idea behind the Shiro's project. And, it keeps evolving and who knows where it'll go next, but it's just kind of an ongoing project.
Oh, it must be a tremendous amount of, I mean, it's a photo a day for several years now, right? So that's quite
Well,
impressive.
yeah, like, it was a portrait a day for the first couple months, and then it was more like, 3 portraits a week, and now it's like maybe, it depends. Again, the news cycle tends to drive the project because I use hashtags to help amplify it. So if there's not, as I said, Beyonce is trending because of Cowboy Carter, Caitlin Clark's trending because of the March Madness. Um, you know, I tend to rely on that to decide who I'm going to paint. But yeah, it definitely. And I also, my work has shifted a little bit. Once Trump no longer was president, I was like, I can have the joy of painting for fun as well now. So I do like paint for fun as well, but not for fun, but I mean, I'll paint stuff that's not political now as well. So because I deserve to be happy.
Yeah, well, definitely, yes, and you are doing a lot of great work.
There's my little dog Frida. She had to come say hi.
Oh, hello, Frida. Um, well, thank you so much for coming on and talk to me. The work you're doing is so important, and often, um, unappreciated. I find like the work that women are doing up in the party.
Yes.
Um, we're recording this the day after the decision in the Florida Supreme Court, letting the abortion ban stand, while also saying that an amendment could go forth on the November ballot to protect abortion rights, which gives a chance to actually, preserve those rights, though it's still, as you were saying, kind of like this constant battle since 2022 of what they're doing. What are your thoughts on that before we kind of
Oh,
take off?
it's thank you for asking, and it is so difficult because, you know, I personally, and maybe I'm a ridiculous optimist, and that's the only way I can function. I think hope is important, and I believe that we will win this fight. I just think that it's going to take some time, and a lot of people will be hurt while we are fighting this fight. I think that the fact that the Supreme Court in Florida, on one hand, approved the 6-week abortion, and on the other hand, said that the uh, petition to enshrine abortion rights could go forward. The fact that those happen on the same days is it's awful to say, but it's very beneficial for the Democratic Party. Uh,
Mhm.
and I hate to say that because it's going to harm a lot of women. But the fact that you have this draconian abortion ban and the ability to reverse it on the ballot in November in Florida is a game changer. Florida was a long shot flippable state before yesterday. Today it is a flippable state, in my opinion. So I am heartbroken and devastated by the harm that these things are causing women, and not just in Florida. We're talking Louisiana and Alabama and Texas and Oklahoma and all of these states. And so many women are being harmed. And I want to cry, but I have to focus on the fact that we can fix it. I believe we will fix it, but we must fight, 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 fight. and we must vote Democrat, and not just this November. It's probably going to take a few more election cycles to, and I think that that's where people get so short-sighted. Everyone's like, we voted for Biden in 2020 and he hasn't fixed everything in the past 3 years. I'm like, he fixed a lot. He's fixed a lot. There
Mhm.
was just, he inherited a dumpster fire of a situation, and so he hasn't fixed everything. And the abortion issue has been incredibly, especially tricky because it relies on the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is Donald Trump's Supreme Court. And I go back, going back to Hillary Clinton. I remember conversations in 2016 where I said, I don't care if you hate Hillary Clinton, please vote for her for the Supreme Court. And I had people tell me, you deserve to lose Roe because you voted for Hillary.
Mhm.
And so, I guess that's just my own frustration speaking there. But like, I just think that, we made the first right step in 2018 when we elected a record number of women to Congress. We made the second right step in 2020 when we elected Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We made another great step in the right direction in 2022 when we had the best showing by the incumbent party of a president in a midterm in like decades, right?
Mhm.
And every single election since 2022 and now where abortion has been on the ballot, we have made progress. So I'm hopeful, but I just think that there's going to be so much damage done before we get this fixed. And that's why, like, on my website, I have a resources page, which has ways for people to get involved in politics, but also it has a list of abortion providers and people who have funds to help women in red states come to blue states to get abortions and that sort of stuff. Because while we are working to do the work of changing the political structure that allowed women to be in this horrible spot, we also have to do whatever we can to protect women who are suffering while we're waiting for elections to fix it.
No, so it's a great point, and it's a great way of communicating the challenge. I think it's for a lot of average voters, they tend to things are bad things are happening to me. Who's in charge? And this is sort of in a weird way a rare situation because of sort of a radicalized Supreme Court that you have. Well, Trump's gone; he's not in office while this is happening, but obviously his mark is enduring because the court, in is there. So um that's really good to put in perspective. And yeah, hopefully um it's a very high threshold. A 60% is necessary in Florida, which we hope won't be a stretch. I think we've had some overwhelming results in Kansas and Ohio, so maybe we'll see the same in Florida. um but
My
it
friends
is
on the
unfortunate if
ground
people
in
get hurt.
Florida my friends on the ground in Florida think they can do it. So I'm gonna trust that they're right and hope that we can do it. And I'm gonna see if I can find a way to go down there and knock on some doors at some point
Yeah,
between now and November.
that's how it's done, and that's a
That's how
great
it's done.
that's a great end note. So thank you so much for doing that. Thank you so much for coming on.
For having
And
me.
thank you. And we'll keep in touch. Take care.
Take care.